Edwards Air Force Base stretches across nearly 500 square miles of Southern California desert, a vast expanse of cracked earth and endless sky where heat shimmers during the day and silence rules the night, earning the place a reputation among its residents as the middle of nowhere, a duty station isolated from cities, yet central to the future of American air power, because here experimental aircraft are born, tested, and sometimes lost to the desert itself. Nestled deep within the northwestern Mojave, Edwards hosts the Air Force Test Center, the Elite Test Pilot School, and NASA's Armstrong Flight Research Center, drawing engineers, pilots, and security forces into a landscape that appears empty but never truly is, for the desert has a way of concealing its life until darkness gives it permission to move. To newcomers, the base feels harsh and unforgiving, a parched wilderness of dry lake beds and jagged hills. But to veteran airmen, it feels watchful, as if the land itself is aware of the classified work unfolding upon it, and quietly judging the humans who dared to build runways and radar towers across its ancient body. Daylight belongs to technology, to roaring engines and white contrails etched across blue skies. Yet when the sun sinks behind distant mountains and the desert cools, another atmosphere settles in, one filled with tension and unspoken caution, because the night shift belonged to security patrols who know that the most unsettling activity at Edwards does not always come from the air. Officially, the base is known for UFO rumors, strange lights, and experimental craft glimpsed by civilians beyond the perimeter, stories often dismissed with practiced indifference. But among those who patrol the restricted zones, a different set of whispers circulates, quieter and far more disturbing. Stories of something massive moving through the scrub, something tall and broad that leaves footprints no animal should make, and moves with a confidence that suggests intelligence rather than instinct. The Mojave Desert at night plays tricks on the senses, wind carving voices from empty space and shadows stretching into impossible shapes. Yet seasoned guards insist there are moments when fear does not come from imagination, but from recognition, a primal understanding that something unseen is close and watching. Radio chatter grows tense during those hours, every routine check-in carrying a subtle edge, because Edwards is not just surrounded by wilderness, it is embedded within it, and the fences and warning signs feel thin against the sheer scale of the land beyond. Long before jets screamed overhead and classified projects reshaped the future, this desert belonged to something else, something that learned the rhythms of the land and adapted to survive within it. And now, as patrol vehicles crawl along empty roads under star-filled skies, the men and women inside them sometimes feel less like guardians and more like intruders. The base may test machines that push the limits of speed and altitude, but on the ground, far from the runways and control towers, there's a growing sense that Edwards Air Force Base stands on territory that has never been fully claimed, a place where modern military power coexists uneasily with an ancient presence, patient and observant, waiting for moments when the desert grows quiet enough to remind its human occupants that they are not alone. These feelings are rarely written down, never included in official briefings, and almost never discussed outside trusted circles, because acknowledging them would mean admitting uncertainty, and uncertainty has no place in military doctrine. Still, over time, patterns emerge that cannot be ignored, patrol routes quietly adjusted, certain zones avoided when possible, and jokes made too often to be harmless. Veterans warn newcomers to respect the desert, to trust their instincts, and to remember that not every threat announces itself with alarms or gunfire. At Edwards, the most dangerous encounters are the ones that leave no physical damage, only the lingering certainty that something has been observed and measured by eyes older than radar systems. The desert keeps its own records, written in sand and shadow, erased by wind yet remembered by those who walk its lonely roads, night after night, under a sky that feels vast enough to hide anything. The night at Edwards Air Force Base had begun like countless others, quiet and uneventful, the kind of shift that lulled security personnel into a false sense of routine as radios crackled softly and patrol vehicles crawled across empty stretches of desert road, But deep within the restricted zones of the base, at a classified installation known only as Project Logic, something moved that would shatter the illusion of control and leave a permanent scar on those who heard the transmission that followed. Project Logic was one of those locations spoken of only in low voices, a site surrounded by warning signs and layers of authorization, where even seasoned airmen knew better than to ask questions. And on that night, a lone patrolman had been assigned to monitor its perimeter. His job simple in theory: observe, report, and deter trespassers, but the desert had other plans. Shortly after midnight, the base security desk received a sudden radio call that cut through the monotony like a blade. The patrolman's voice high, strained, and unmistakably flooded with terror as he shouted for immediate backup, repeating the same words again and again about a massive shape advancing toward him out of the darkness. The dispatcher attempted to calm him, demanding clarity, but before any meaningful response could be given, the transmission erupted into chaos. Sharp gunshots cracking through the speaker, heavy breathing filling the channel, and then a final sound that no one could quite describe before the line went dead, replaced by a silence so complete it felt deliberate. Response teams were dispatched immediately, racing across the desert toward Project Logic with headlights slicing through the night. Every man inside the vehicles aware that something had gone catastrophically wrong, yet none of them prepared for what they would find upon arrival. The patrol vehicle lay overturned as if it had been lifted and tossed aside, its undercarriage exposed to the stars, and nearby the patrolman's rifle rested in the sand, snapped cleanly in two, not bent or damaged by machinery, but broken with a force that suggested raw strength beyond human capability. The guard himself was found several yards away, alive and without visible injury, but mentally shattered, sitting motionless with wide, unfocused eyes, unable to speak or respond to questions, his entire body trembling as though his mind were still trapped in the moment of encounter. Surrounding the scene were footprints that defied explanation. Enormous bare impressions pressed deep into the desert floor, 5 distinct toes visible in each, arranged in patterns that suggested movement rather than panic, as if whatever made them had paced the area calmly, deliberately, inspecting its surroundings before departing. The Office of Special Investigations was quietly notified, and within hours the site was sealed off, the incident scrubbed from official records, and the men involved instructed to say nothing. Yet rumors spread faster than any formal report ever could, whispered through barracks and patrol rooms, growing darker with each retelling. It was said the patrolman had emptied his entire magazine at the approaching figure without slowing it, that the creature had moved faster than headlights could track, and that it had vanished into the desert without leaving so much as a broken branch behind. No official explanation was ever offered, and the patrolman was quietly removed from a base, first sent to a military hospital and later reassigned overseas, his name effectively erased from Edwards' history. But among the Air Force Police's encounter became a warning passed down to every new shift. From that night forward, Project Logic carried a different weight, a place avoided when possible, respected when not, because the men who walked those roads understood something fundamental had been revealed. Whatever lived beyond the fences was not intimidated by weapons, vehicles, or authority. The desert had reached into one of the most secure installations on the base and reminded everyone present that technology and secrecy mean little when confronted by something that understands fear and uses it as effortlessly as humans use light. Even years later, veterans would recall the sound of that radio call, the way it rose and broke apart, and they would agree on one thing without hesitation. The patrolman at Project Logic did not imagine what he saw, because imagination does not leave footprints that deep. By the spring of 1974, the incident at Project Logic had faded from official memory, but not from the minds of those who worked the night shifts. And it was during this uneasy period that another encounter unfolded near a powerful communications hub known as Mars Station, a lonely installation surrounded by warning signs, microwave towers, and vast stretches of desert where sound seemed to die before it could travel. Sergeant Michael House was an experienced security policeman, familiar with night patrols and no stranger to the strange illusions the desert could produce. And on the night in question, he had been assigned to patrol the outskirts of the station, testing a newly installed spotlight as he made his rounds. The desert was unusually still, the kind of silence that presses against the ears, and as House guided his patrol truck along a service road, he noticed something off to his left, roughly 200 to 300 yards away, a pair of large blue lights hovering above the scrub. At first he assumed they belonged to an animal, perhaps reflected eyes caught in the beam. But as he slowed the vehicle and focused his attention, he felt an immediate sense of unease, because these eyes were unlike anything he had seen before, far larger than those of any known desert creature and positioned far higher off the ground, nearly 7 feet by his estimation. House stopped the truck completely and watched, expecting the lights to vanish. But instead they moved, gliding toward him at a steady pace, not bobbing or shifting the way an animal's eyes would, but floating smoothly as if mounted on an invisible rail. He strained to make out a body behind them, yet the darkness seemed to swallow any shape that might have accompanied the lights, leaving only the glowing blue orb suspended in the night. As they closed the distance, circling his vehicle with deliberate intent, the hair on the back of his neck stood on end, and a powerful stench filled the air, a rotten, organic smell so strong it made his eyes water and his stomach tighten with instinctive dread. The lights drew closer still, now within 50 yards, and House felt a rising certainty that whatever was watching him was fully aware of his presence and reacting to it, not out of curiosity, but calculation. At that precise moment, his radio crackled to life with an urgent message ordering him to return to base immediately. An interruption that cut through his fear like a lifeline, and without hesitation, he started the engine and drove away, never once looking back. When House returned to the area several hours later with additional personnel, the desert had erased the encounter as if it had never occurred, rain having washed away any possible tracks, and no trace of the blue lights remained. Despite his shaken state, House filed an official report detailing the size, movement, and behavior of what he had seen, but the response he received was not investigation or concern. Only laughter and thinly veiled ridicule from fellow airmen and dismissive remarks from superiors who suggested fatigue and imagination were to blame. The commanding officer insisted that the desert could produce eerie visual effects at night and that no further action was necessary. Yet the reaction had an unintended consequence, because from that point on, patrolmen became reluctant to report anything unusual, having learned that honesty would only bring mockery or disciplinary scrutiny. In the weeks that followed, however, the reports did not stop. They simply changed form, shared quietly between trusted colleagues rather than through official channels, stories of dark figures passing high windows at Mars Station, shapes that would have had to stand nearly 8 feet tall, and of heavy footsteps crunching through gravel outside buildings late at night. In one instance, a glass soda bottle left near a doorway was found pulverized, flattened into the ground as if stepped on by something immensely heavy. And though some sightings were eventually explained away as wild burros moving silently through the sage, seasoned patrolmen noted that burros did not move with such speed or intelligence, nor did their eyes glide unnaturally through the darkness. The blue eyes became a symbol of something the base refused to acknowledge, a reminder that whatever had approached Sergeant House had done so with purpose, testing boundaries, observing reactions, and withdrawing only when ordered forces converged. Over time, Mars Station earned a quiet reputation among night patrols, a place where radios seemed to crackle more often and instincts screamed louder, because House's encounter had made one thing clear to those willing to listen. The desert around Edwards was not empty, and some things that lived within it did not fear being seen. By the winter of 1974, the desert surrounding Edwards Air Force Base had become a place of unspoken rules and quiet understanding among those assigned to night patrol, and it was during this period that Sergeant Barton encountered something that shifted fear into certainty, because unlike fleeting lights or distant shapes, what he found that night could be measured, traced, and remembered. Barton was patrolling near the Rocket Propulsion Laboratory on the eastern edge of the base, a massive complex dedicated to testing engines powerful enough to push machines beyond Earth's atmosphere, an area riddled with restricted zones and warning signs cautioning against toxic materials and experimental hazards. Shortly before midnight, Barton noticed strange blue lights flickering in the nearby mountains, faint but deliberate, and assuming they belonged to an unauthorized vehicle, he drove toward them with the intention of intercepting a trespasser. As he approached, the lights vanished abruptly, leaving only darkness and silence. And when Barton attempted to maneuver his patrol truck closer, the vehicle became mired in soft desert sand, its tires sinking deeper with every attempt to escape. With no other option, Barton shut down the engine and began the long walk back toward base, the desert wind carrying faint sounds that made him pause more than once, though he could see nothing moving around him. Nearly 2 miles later, he encountered another patrol, and together they radioed for a tow truck, returning to Barton's stranded vehicle with a small convoy that cut bright lines through the darkness. What they found upon arrival changed the tone of the night instantly, because surrounding the truck were footprints that did not belong to any known animal. Large three-toed impressions pressed deeply into the sand, each measuring nearly 14 inches in length, with what appeared to be a clawed digit or protrusion at the heel. The tracks formed a wide circle around the vehicle, as though whatever had made them had slowly walked around the truck, examining it from all sides before moving off into the desert on 2 legs. The wind was already working to erase the details, blowing soft sand into the impressions and making precise documentation difficult. But the sheer size and unnatural shape of the tracks left no room for easy dismissal. Barton stood silently, staring down at the evidence, his thoughts drifting to stories from his family back in Missouri about a creature they called Momo, a massive, hairy, Bigfoot-like being that had been seen prowling rural properties and had even been shot at without effect. When Barton finally spoke, he did so carefully, asking the others if they had ever heard of such things. And though one patrolman laughed nervously, another admitted he had seen strange blue lights in the hills weeks earlier. No formal report was filed that night, because Barton understood the consequences of speaking too openly, and the men involved made an unspoken agreement to keep the incident between themselves. Only weeks later, however, another patrolman, Sergeant Jones, would face something even more unsettling in the same region. When he radioed headquarters late one night, requesting his replacement to hurry, his voice tense as he explained that whatever he was observing was large and moving closer. Jones had been parked near the rocket testing site, the moon high enough to cast silver light across the hills, when he noticed a massive silhouette moving along a ridgeline, its torso immense and its movements smooth, deliberate, and unmistakably alive. As he watched, 2 large luminescent eyes, glowing green-blue, appeared and began advancing toward his position, not bouncing like a walking human, but gliding effortlessly, as if the ground itself offered no resistance. Jones felt an overwhelming sense of vulnerability and stepped out of his vehicle, retreating toward the road just as another patrol car appeared in the distance, summoned by an unrelated report of strange lights in the area. When the 2 vehicles met, the glowing eyes vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind only strange depressions in the ground and countless overlapping tracks that made it impossible to follow any single trail. One of the responding patrolmen refused to exit his vehicle, unwilling to expose himself to whatever might still be nearby, and no one could blame him, because by then it was becoming clear that these encounters were not isolated incidents or tricks of the imagination, but repeated interactions with something intelligent enough to approach, observe, and withdraw at will. The 3-toed tracks around Barton's truck and the countless impressions near Jones's position told the same story in different ways. That something was moving freely through restricted military zones, leaving physical proof behind just long enough to be noticed, and then allowing the desert to erase its presence, as if reminding the men of Edwards Air Force Base that no matter how advanced their technology became, the land beneath their feet still answered to older rules. As the years passed and encounters continued to surface in hushed conversations rather than official reports, a deeper truth about Edwards Air Force Base slowly emerged through civilian investigators and former military personnel who were willing to speak only under promises of anonymity, revealing that the strange creatures roaming the desert were not merely rumors whispered among night patrols, but subjects of quiet military observation that dated back years. In the late 1970s, researchers following a trail of desert Sasquatch sightings began hearing the same unsettling detail repeated by unrelated witnesses. The military already knew. According to multiple former security officers stationed at Edwards, night patrols were not only equipped with standard gear, but also with advanced surveillance tools for the era, including starlight scopes, motion detectors, and early night vision technology, all deployed primarily to detect intruders attempting to spy on classified aircraft projects. Yet again and again, these systems detected something else entirely. One former lieutenant responsible for overseeing a large security sector near Rogers Dry Lake described receiving a report from a guard who claimed a very tall man, but not really a man, had breached the perimeter, and though the lieutenant initially suspected fatigue or panic, he decided to investigate personally, only to witness, through a powerful tripod-mounted starlight scope, a towering, hair-covered humanoid figure moving slowly across the desert floor. The creature appeared calm and purposeful, its massive frame clearly visible through the scope as it wandered among the rocks, occasionally lowering its head as if searching for something in the sand, unconcerned with fences, sensors, or patrol routes. The lieutenant reported the sighting to higher command and was instructed not to engage, but simply to observe, an order that struck him as unusual yet final. And moments later, a helicopter swept in from the east, its approach loud and aggressive, causing the creature to react instantly, turning and fleeing with astonishing speed and agility, vanishing behind a rock formation before the aircraft could intercept it. The following day, instead of disbelief or alarm, the lieutenant was met with quiet acknowledgement, informed by command staff that similar creatures had been seen before and that they were known publicly as Bigfoot or Sasquatch, a term he had always associated with forested mountains rather than open desert. He was told these beings were under observation, that all related information was classified, and that discussing such encounters outside authorized channels would not be tolerated, not because the creatures were considered a threat, but because their existence posed a different kind of problem. The base's leadership feared that public knowledge of large, unknown humanoids freely moving through restricted areas would undermine confidence in base security, potentially encouraging trespassers, thrill seekers, and conspiracy hunters to attempt entry, a risk deemed unacceptable given the level of classified work conducted there. Over time, surveillance efforts expanded, with cameras placed in strategic locations and footage quietly archived, and though little was learned about the creature's origins, patterns began to form. They were primarily nocturnal, rarely aggressive, highly intelligent, and seemingly aware of human intent, often avoiding areas where tension or hostility was present and lingering longer where patrols have been instructed not to interfere. Another former officer confirmed that these creatures were observed frequently enough to be considered a routine anomaly, something noted and logged internally but never escalated. And while UFO sightings generated intense scrutiny and immediate response, the desert beings were treated almost like part of the environment, strange but manageable. Lower-ranking guards were rarely told the full truth, only warned not to pursue certain shapes or lights, and never to fire unless directly threatened, while officers alone handled documentation and review of surveillance material. This separation ensured that most personnel remained uncertain, caught between fear and doubt, while the full picture stayed locked behind classification barriers. Those who had seen the creatures clearly through scopes or monitors described them as massive, powerfully built, fully covered in dark hair except for their faces, palms, and soles of their feet, with long arms and a posture that blended animal strength with human-like awareness. What disturbed many observers most was not their appearance, but their behavior, the way they seemed to understand patrol patterns, the way they paused to watch vehicles pass, and the way they vanished the moment serious attention turned toward them. By quietly watching the watchers, these beings demonstrated an unsettling awareness of the base's routines, and in doing so they forced a silent compromise. The military would observe but not intervene, and the desert creatures would continue to move through Edwards Air Force Base like shadows with substance, unacknowledged yet unmistakably real. Reminders that even the most secure installations on Earth exist within a world that still holds secrets beyond human command. As disturbing as the desert encounters were, what unsettled senior personnel at Edwards Air Force Base far more was the realization that these beings were not limited to the open wilderness. Because by the late 1970s, multiple high-ranking officers confirmed that the creatures had begun appearing in places civilians would never imagine existed beneath the base itself. Edwards is not just runways and hangars. Beneath its surface lies a classified network of underground tunnels and service corridors built to protect sensitive equipment, personnel, and communication lines during emergencies. Structures known only to those with the highest clearances and never acknowledged in public documents. According to a retired major who served at Edwards for nearly a decade, security cameras installed in these tunnels had captured footage that left no room for denial, showing large, hair-covered humanoid figures calmly walking through restricted subterranean passages as if they had every right to be there. These were not frantic or lost creatures. Their movements were deliberate and unhurried, their posture relaxed, suggesting familiarity rather than intrusion. And this behavior deeply troubled base leadership because it meant the creatures not only understood the surface environment, but also knew access points humans believed were hidden. The major explained that these sightings forced command to confront a difficult conclusion. The beings were highly intelligent, capable of navigating complex environments, and possibly aware of the base's purpose and limitations. Despite this, no attempt was made to capture or eliminate them, a decision driven not by compassion, but by calculation, because any aggressive action carried unknown consequences, and leadership feared retaliation or exposure far more than continued observation. Surveillance footage from the tunnels was immediately classified at the highest level, stored alongside other sensitive materials, and access was restricted to a small circle of officers, ensuring that the existence of the creatures remained compartmentalized and deniable. Lower-ranking security personnel, often referred to dismissively as grunts, were intentionally kept in the dark, though many of them suspected the truth after repeatedly encountering unexplained figures through starlight scopes on surface patrols. One former security officer, barely 19 years old during his service, later admitted that he had seen the creatures dozens of times, sometimes alone, sometimes in small groups, and once even witnessing what he believed to be a female accompanied by a smaller juvenile, an observation that suggested not monsters but a breeding population. He described them as towering over 10 feet tall in some cases, fully covered in dark hair except for their faces, hands, and the bottoms of their feet, with long arms that nearly reached their knees and faces that resembled apes, yet carried an unsettling intelligence in their expression. Their feet, he noted, were shaped much like human feet, but lacked a defined arch, and tracking them across the desert revealed a confident, balanced gait that left deep impressions even in hard-packed soil. What struck him most was not their size, but their awareness, because they seemed to know when they were being observed and when they were not, sometimes pausing to look directly toward patrol vehicles or surveillance equipment before slipping effortlessly back into concealment. When asked why he believed the creatures continued to return to Edwards, the former guard offered an explanation that resonated with others who had served there, suggesting that the base represented a rare safe zone, a place where humans were ordered not to hunt, not to interfere, and not to provoke. In the wild, these beings likely faced constant threats from armed civilians, encroaching development, and shrinking habitats, but within the perimeter of a classified military installation, they were protected by secrecy itself. The officer believed the creatures could sense intent, that they understood which humans meant harm and which were constrained by orders, and that this awareness allowed them to move with relative confidence through areas where they knew they would not be pursued. This theory was reinforced by the fact that sightings often increased after patrols were explicitly instructed to disengage from unusual encounters, as if the beings had learned to recognize a shift in human behavior. For base leadership, the presence of these creatures beneath Edwards represented a paradox, an undeniable security breach that could never be acknowledged, because admitting that unknown beings freely entered restricted underground facilities would shatter public trust and invite scrutiny far more dangerous than the creatures themselves. And so the policy remained unchanged: observe, record, classify, and remain silent. Over time, The tunnels beneath Edwards became another layer of the base's mystery, a hidden world beneath a hidden world, where advanced human technology and ancient non-human intelligence passed each other in the dark without confrontation, bound together by secrecy and the unspoken agreement that some truths were safer buried beneath sand and concrete, never meant to rise to the surface. By the time the 1980s and early 1990s arrived, Edwards Air Force Base had changed on the surface, but remained exactly the same beneath, its runways modernized, its technology refined, and its security protocols updated, yet the quiet understanding about what moved through the surrounding desert endured, passed down not through manuals, but through guarded conversations and carefully chosen warnings to those new enough to listen. Former security personnel who returned to civilian life carried the memories with them, often suppressing them for years until they discovered, sometimes by accident, that others had seen the same impossible things, and it was only then that they realized the encounters were not isolated events, but chapters in a much larger, ongoing story. One former contract security officer, who worked at Edward from the late 1980s into the early 1990s, later admitted that when he first read public accounts describing desert Sasquatch sightings near the base, he felt a mix of shock and relief, because the stories matched almost perfectly with what he and others had experienced, confirming that the strange figures near the rocket site in North Base were still being seen long after earlier reports had supposedly ended. According to him, the stories were still quietly told to new guards as a kind of initiation, not to frighten them, but to prepare them, because Edwards was a place where denial could be dangerous and awareness could save lives. He described how sightings continued to occur in familiar areas, particularly near isolated test facilities and long stretches of road far from main operations, where tall shapes were spotted crossing under moonlight or standing motionless at the edge of headlights, watching patrol vehicles pass without reacting. These encounters rarely escalated, but the tension they created lingered because the beings never behaved like animals startled by light or noise. Instead, they seemed curious, observant, and always in control of the distance between themselves and humans. What disturbed many veterans most was the sense that the creatures understood the boundaries of the base better than most people did, appearing where security coverage was thin and withdrawing the moment additional forces were dispatched, as if they were constantly testing responses and memorizing patterns. Over time, some officers even began to view their presence with a strange sense of acceptance, reasoning that if these beings had wanted to cause harm, they had more than enough opportunity to do so. And yet they never did, choosing instead to coexist in the margins of human activity. This attitude, however, was never allowed to surface officially, because the military's greatest fear was not the creatures themselves, but what public knowledge of them would unleash. An influx of thrill seekers, conspiracy theorists, and armed civilians convinced they could succeed where the Air Force had chosen restraint. As a result, silence remained the strongest line of defense, reinforced by classification, ridicule, and the careful framing of any unexplained incident as a misunderstanding or natural phenomenon. Even so, the desert resisted complete erasure, because physical reminders occasionally surfaced. Unexplained tracks after a night of heavy winds, damaged equipment found far from where it should have been, and patrolmen who resigned abruptly after a single shift they refused to describe. Those who stayed learned to trust subtle instincts, to listen to the tone of the desert, and to respect certain areas after dark, understanding that Edwards Air Force Base existed within a shared space, one claimed by human ambition, but never fully surrendered by whatever had lived there long before fences and flight lines. Some officers even suggested, half jokingly and half seriously, that the presence of these beings served as a kind of natural security, deterring unauthorized visitors far more effectively than warning signs ever could, because few intruders would willingly cross paths with something that could overturn vehicles and vanish without a trace. Decades after the earliest encounters, reports continue to surface from those still stationed at the base, confirming that the desert Sasquatch had not disappeared, only adapted, remaining just out of sight, patient and watchful, as technology advanced and generations of airmen came and went. And so the story of Edwards Air Force Base remains incomplete, not because evidence is lacking, but because it has been deliberately buried beneath layers of secrecy and disbelief, leaving only fragments to surface in whispers and late-night confessions. The desert, however, keeps no secrets forever, and long after patrol logs are archived and classified tapes degrade, the Mojave will remain vast and indifferent, holding the memory of every footprint pressed into its sand and every human who realized too late that they were never truly alone.